Hello, everyone. My name is Raúl Aguilar, and on behalf of Tab Gallery, we want to welcome you to the first iteration of Artists in Dialogue. In relation to the show, I had the same thought by José Andrés Mora and Chantal Khoury. I'm going to give a brief introduction about both of you, and then I'm going to explain a bit what's the nature of this dialogue. José Andrés Mora is a Venezuelan-Canadian artist. Recent and upcoming exhibitions include a solo show in Maison de la Culture NDG in 2023 in Montreal, a group show at Latcham Art Center in Stouffville in 2023, and an upcoming show at Hamiltonian Artists Inc., right, 2025. Mora is the recipient of numerous grants and recognitions. In 2023, his work was acquired by the Canadian Council of Art Bank. He holds an MFA in the University of Guelph from 2020 and a BFA from the Nova Scotia College of Arts and Design from 2012. Chantal Khoury is of Lebanese descent and was born in the unceded territory of Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq First Nations, New Brunswick. She's based in Toronto after living 3 years in Yokiage, Montreal. Khoury has received numerous grants and exhibitions wildly across North America, including recent solo shows at Bird Contemporary in Toronto in 2021, Michael Gibson Gallery in London, Ontario in 2022. Collections include the Royal Bank of Canada, the Art Gallery of Guelph, and the University of New Brunswick. She holds an MFA from the University of Guelph and a BFA with distinction from Concordia University from 2012 as well. First of all, we want to thank the artists for their generosity of being here and to talk about the exhibition and maybe answer some of the questions that come up by visiting the place, and also expanding kind of like the conversation around your practices and your processes and maybe your personal stories. In the preparation for this talk, we had a meeting, and one of the things that we established that we were interested was to emphasize having an inclusive language. So if at any time we're saying something that feels it doesn't make any sense, or we use a word that is not understandable, or you're out of your kind of like knowledge, please feel free to let us know, and we'll try to explain, or we'll try to just make it easier. Lastly, so the way this dialogue is going to take place is we're going to start by a kind of 10-minute sort of introduction of each one of your practices, not necessarily only talking about the show, the work in this show, but like your ongoing practice. I think that would be interesting also for us to learn the trajectory of how you arrived to this work. And after that, after hearing from you, we're gonna work together to explore the specific exhibition and basically to try to answer the question, what's the show about? And finally, we're gonna speak about the nature of two-person show, which is now it was a little bit of a trademark of TAP since the beginning. It's always been characterized by having these shows between two people. And finally, we're gonna open the floor for questions. But as I mentioned, I think casually, if you have something you wanna say, you can just let us know.
Yeah, for sure. If you have a thought.
Yeah. And luckily, at that time, we're all gonna feel at ease to make questions. And the point of this is to talk more than anything. Chantal, Andres, who do you would like to start?
Come to there.
I can get started. Hi. So I guess I can go a little bit over my art practice maybe, and not necessarily just the work that I am exhibiting here. I'm primarily come from a background of working with media and media installations. I've been working on language-based or text-based work for maybe now about like almost 10-ish years. And that trajectory has been a sort of like evolving slowly towards the kind of work that I'm doing right now. When I started exploring working with language, it very much started for me as a way to kind of explore the way that I related to being able to communicate in English, and sort of the trajectory that went from being a Spanish speaker to being an English speaker. Because I sort of had a very like my trajectory out of Venezuela to Canada was via Mexico City. Actually, first we spent a year there, and even just like the first step of being in Mexico City, like it's like the first time that I was like, oh, I have an accent. I have a way of speaking that has to be like enunciated in a certain way to be able to understood outside of the context that I'm used to communicating in. And so when I started making work about language, was exploring a little bit that sort of like that and trying to create text-based work that put readers in a similar process of like having to slow in a relationship with text that makes you slow down to engage with language in a way that you're outside of the parameters that you're used to for understanding it. So I tend to work a lot with obfuscation and or abstracting writing in a way that makes you feel alienated to the usual ways that you would engage with text, as a way to create that parallel that I felt as a way to create a parallel to the way that I felt with English, and sort of put people in that similar relationship to text. Does that make sense so far? I had to check myself because I can ramble as well, or a couple of ramblers.
Do we have a timer?
A good example is like some of the, like coming back a bit to the exhibition, there's some of the work here that is like text-based, and it has this sort of strategies of obfuscation that we can see in most of the poetry here.
And those text works that are here definitely come from absolutely from that work. And so that's sort of for me, and that's sort of like the beginning, and then like for me that kind of makes it so I started thinking about writing and for like how it has like a spatial presence in a space, and how you're what I mean by that is like the way that you interpret text is sort of very context-based, and how you draw meaning, it depends a lot on the way that in the format that you encounter it, and so for me that kind of gives writing a rather like very like spatial presence, and therefore a very material-based quality. So that's sort of like where the context that I'm coming from, and then slowly I started working a little bit more towards like a process of like recollection and trying to remember what it was like to I guess come from somewhere else. And what I slowly started getting interested in the idea of how we can reconstruct our own memories just by the process of remembering, and how this sort of this process of recalling can become sort of a way to cement a version of your past that it's sort of adorned or fixed with like details that may not be that are sort of shifting and inaccurate. And that kind of started taking me to the pieces that we see here, the prints with the images. All of these images are not, but I make them using a process that is a drawing process, it's kind of like a similar to kind of like almost like a watercolor process, and then like there's several points of color that bleed into each other. So the more points of color that I add, the more they create an image. And so that's kind of where the trajectory of my work thus far, and I'm gonna stop.
Wait, before you stop, can we introduce a little bit your machines?
Yeah.
Just like talk a little, because you're talking about the poetry and the obfuscation of language, and now we're talking about these images. But there is other part of your practice that is text-based, but is also sculptural and is also moves. So I just would like maybe to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. So, because I work with writing and video often too. So a lot of my video pieces have writing. So like one of the things that I find really interesting about time-based media and gallery spaces is that they're this random point of entrance into a narrative that's playing in a loop. So like when you're working as a media artist, your primary, or as a time-based artist, usually your main medium is a loop. You're working with something that is returning to the beginning. And so a lot of the writing that I made for my videos, installations, take into consideration this random point of entry. And so because there's this because there's that quality to the way that media art works in galleries, I tend to make pieces of writing that sort of like start and fall. So there's always sort of a point of entry that kind of makes sense. And I try to make them so that they loop seamlessly back to the beginning. So this is taking me towards like the machines. The machines that I use tend to be sort of like motion based, and they kind of build on the sort of temporal aspect of media-based work, and also they build on sort of, I guess, like the time-based process that is reading any piece of text as well. And for me, they're a way to further exploit or further use text as a sculptural material, because it sort of makes you enter the writing through your relationship to the writing as it is in the space. And so that to me is sort of like another way to create that alienation that I was talking about, like you're like losing a sense of familiarity with language. That is sort of like a mechanism to just amplify that a little bit more.
Yeah, to make it more evident in the space as well.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you a lot. Yeah, and again, we're gonna have questions in the end, so keep in mind everything that has been said. Chantal, so yeah, your turn.
Also, like if you're more comfortable in French too, that's fine for questions for me anyway. Thanks for coming. It's really hot out. And yeah, thanks Raúl for the intro and everything. I'm like, okay, I'll start chronologically also. Yes, born and raised in New Brunswick, East Coast. Left at 19, came to Montreal, ended up staying here for 13 years and going to Concordia, where I actually met Raúl many moons ago. And then went on to do my MFA at Guelph, which is kind of where, MFA, the like pressure cooker where things just kind of happen in a direction that you don't understand until it's like in retrospect. But materially, I'm like on the opposite spectrum of José Andrés. I've been very dedicated to painting and the materiality of painting. I'm kind of a stereotype, I would say. Like I was 6 years old, like I'm going to be a painter, trying to prove all my high school counselors wrong. So yeah, that's like where it began. In general, I find for me, painting is the output, but what informs the work comes from many, many different fields, which I don't give a lot of emphasis to those fields necessarily in like conceptually framing my work in those fields. But for example, you know, I'm a big movie buff, and I read a lot of kind of thinkers around film, especially from transnational histories that relate to art history as well. So I found meaning in one writer called Jalal Tufik, who he's actually notorious for writing in a way that nobody can really understand. But there was a thought that I really took from him and really related to, and it was he's of Lebanese descent as well, but he actually lived through the wars, which as well my parents did. And he speaks about cultural withdrawal, but how cultural withdrawal continues far past the events that have actually done the withdrawing. So, for instance, my existence and how I navigate my life it just makes a lot of sense to me to frame it in how that withdrawal is still happening and it will continue to happen. But I also don't like to be pigeonholed in painting specifically into hybridity, into, you know, post-colonial discourse, because for me it's a more nuanced and it's more expansive than that. So when I'm painting, I'm thinking more about transformation and more about pushing and pulling and bringing subjects almost into fruition, but taking them away as well. So there's nuance there as well that is hard to put in words. But I'm also a big fan of changing my words, and I'm a big fan of changing my context too. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Cool.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not a question, just an expansion. And it doesn't
yeah.
have to be too long.
Sure.
But this term that you use, cultural withdrawal,
Yes.
could you expand a little bit on
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So if we're going to relate it to painting, why not? I'm a painter, I guess. The subjects I use inherited objects from my family's immigration as the starting point for the subject. And for me, those kind of symbolize a link, but also a withdrawal, if that makes sense. I'm not going to claim that I lived anything I necessarily directly talk about in the work, but for me, it's how am I expressing like a continued withdrawal from, moving countries. Living in the Maritimes was a very particular experience for me. It's a place that I love dearly, but it was a place I never had deep roots in, right? So, those kinds of things, the withdrawal from the beginning to end, but trying to still not see it as something that's negative, because it's not. It's like it's a moving thing. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah. And also, you don't know anything else. You
No,
know? This is
right?
what you know. This is what you.
We can all relate to these things. It's
totally.
just kind of how I deal with it on canvas. Yeah.
Okay, maybe in that note,
Yeah.
because you're done with the.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe with this kind of note, it would be good to start thinking of like, what is this show about? So now that we know a little bit more about your practices, and I heard this cultural withdrawal term, and you talk about memory, remembering, rebuilding. So what is, I had the same thought.
Do you want to talk, or do you want me to talk?
Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're going to be really honest about the show. So we're like, let's just say it how it happened. So yeah, Mark's asked me to be the second person in this show, which we were really excited about. While we were working on our practices for the show, you were in Finland for a big chunk of that. So we were actually working pretty separately.
Yeah.
But seeing as how we're very close and we discuss these themes on a regular basis, we kind of had faith in that things would come together in some way. Our practices are like this, and we were like, how are we going to make this work? So it was really interesting through the process of talking to each other a bit here and there. Leading up to the show, we realized we have a lot more in common with what drives our work. So it's not really about the final results, but what begins it, hence the name. I had the same thought.
Yeah, I think we really wanted to emphasize that because it's tricky with the practices coming like that end up in like you use the word for your work. You calling painting is the output, and I think like our outputs are so different, but like I think they can be sort of traced to similar origins, and including also process a little bit too, which is was unexpected, but in a way like for me too, like it was I don't know. I think like we also wanted to. How do I say this? Like we were sort of seeing a little bit of each other's work while we were working, but it wasn't like a very like looking at too much at each other's work either.
We wanted to keep it open and free because like when you're contrived and when you have like a framework to work within, it can take away from the process, right? Like you would understand, I'm sure, as a painter.
But also, I guess like when I'm more, but it seems like there is a part of the working together or like we're working towards this exhibition that happened independently. Was there a point where we were both talking and it's like, let's put some guidelines to this?
Well, yeah, maybe talk about subject because that's where we have the link.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're both. I mean, I guess like you mean referring to like our family histories kind of thing. Yeah. So like we both, I guess, have very similar experiences of I guess trying to make sense of how and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but relating to like finding a way to like relate to like our own family histories and like the places that we're in, and that was a very easy way for us to guide the general theme and approach to the exhibition. But it was like still very important for us to kind of like define those boundaries, but leave it loose enough that we both felt able to experiment enough. But I would say that was like the most defined boundary that we would set up for the exhibition.
Yeah.
And now that it's done, because it's the other thing. One thing is that you work on this thing independently, not seeing each other, blah, blah, blah. But then you make the show, and then it's been like 4 weeks, and you see it again.
Yeah.
And then maybe you're gonna start recognizing stuff that at the beginning it was like, oh, I didn't notice all these other similarities that we didn't spoke. But then now that it's together in the same room, I start recognizing things.
Yeah, can I say something about that?
Please, yeah.
There is like something that I didn't realize when I started working on these drawings, because these drawings for me, this process for me started in 2021, and I continued it and was working on it more on doing a residency in Finland. And one of the things that I noticed is that this process of drawing is sort of very additive and subtractive as well. And when you talk about like the pushing and pulling of your painted work, it's sort of, that felt like a very like beautiful coincidence, I would say.
Yeah.
It's such a painter conversation.
It is. I know. We're getting into process.
Cool.
I know.
No, and when I see them, honestly, I feel like I tend to see everything as a painting.
He's a painter.
I'm a painter. But when I see them, and I've tried to figure out the process, and after hearing you speak about it, I also feel like, oh, this feels more like a painting than anything else. It feels more like a painting that a photograph feels more than a painting, that even a drawing, you know, like
I kind of feel the same way too. I kind of had a hard time because it's not really a process that like I've really, maybe there's like, I don't really like, I haven't really, I had a hard time describing like what it is because I did want it to feel like a blurred photograph. But a lot of like the considerations in it, like for similar to painting, of like how do you create layering, like by just like
You
literally-
build it like a painting.
Yeah,
build it like-
yeah,
yeah.
like
you
by
paint.
putting colors next to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like
it does look like a photograph
yeah.
until you get close.
Yeah.
And then you start seeing like the little kind of little details of like where the point really becomes very, very wide, you know? Cool, nice, thank you a lot. And so yeah, I think we talk a little bit about it, but and it also has to do with this sort of nature of like, now that we see the show, we can start recognizing things that are similar. There's this anchors that I'm gonna call anchors for the work, and the way I'm seeing it is like your paintings have this kind of Aphrodite sculptures, and then from your work, this that I was telling you, like the Pepsi building, the Pepsi building, it has its anchor in these objects, let's call them, and it seems that you're talking a lot of like personal histories, immigration, memory. Was it something that you both did naturally, like kind of anchoring the practice into this sort of objects that become meaningful, just through the memory or through like trying to remember them? Because especially in those two pieces of work, it feels like there is an intention to depict something that is not very fresh in your head. You know, like how does this actually look like? Or yeah. And then it slowly starts becoming more present or more physical. Is this something you spoke about after the fact, or is something that, yeah?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I'll speak for myself and then we could probably see a link there. But I mean, I always am drawn to iconography. I grew up around, again, the physical, like the actual objects that were brought with my grandparents in the 50s to Fredericton, New Brunswick. Like these are the material things that we, we're connected to objects. So the forms that you do see, they begin there. And this is a bit of a new direction for me, the Aphrodite, the Venus, the lambs of God that are in the back, the bull. But an ongoing theme of mine is the Virgin Mary, because that is very much for me linked to the immigrant home and domestic intimacy, and how those. I'm not a religious person, but in my experience anyway, that kind of hope and connection beyond immigration is amplified in those objects. My grandmother had all of the Lady of Lebanon statues around her. So these are the things that really give me kind of like the inspiration to paint them. And I'm something I didn't mention yet is, and I realized this in school, is it was really hard for me to, in that context of academia, to justify why I was doing things a certain way to my community there. It gave me a lot of really amazing education and people that I met, but for me specifically, it was a battle in terms of what I was reading, who I was looking at, because I was looking at painters from modern abstraction, not from the West, but from modern abstraction, who were doing the exact same kind of gestural erasure, all of these kind of material things, but they were doing it with very informed meaning and very informed subjectivity, which is something that is not always supported when you're in the academic context. So for me, that was a drive to bring in the personal even more with that historical context, if that makes sense. Yeah. So like those pieces that everyone can kind of recognize, oh, like that's Venus or that's a snake. I love using those kind of subjects that everybody can relate to in a different way. And I'm just, I kind of stopped caring that people are like, oh, that's too meaningful. I'm like, so I'm a painter.
Well, first of all, sometimes you don't recognize them.
Yeah.
You know,
sure,
like not
yeah.
everybody comes from the same
Yeah.
household. So sometimes you see something that just looks like a sculpture.
Yeah,
You
even
know?
better though.
And
even better.
but my point is also it's not obvious. Like each
Yeah.
part is very culturally specific, and there's something that for me is always very nice about conversations and about text from a show is that you have these little references.
Yeah, for sure.
And so you were talking about this more sort of like religious symbols that become cultural symbols through immigration.
Exactly, yeah.
And your reference, at least the one that I'm looking at right now, it feels more like a secular reference of like capitalism.
Yeah, it's funny when you were talking about your work and like the kind of like references to objects that you do. I think that's like a similarity, but also a difference between the way that we approach work because you're working with these objects that are in a way kind of like tangible in your life and in your family home in a way that like I'm working a little bit more with objects that have meaning to my family and like where we grew up, but it's sort of a little bit more removed from the object itself. And for me, that's pretty helpful because, at least for this process, because that removal is kind of what I'm interested in working with the reconstruction of something that I'm far away from and have been far away from for a while. And so all of the images in the show come from different parts of I guess my home in Caracas, where I grew up. The three prints that are in this corner are a reference to a type of tree called the jabillo tree. Which is a kind of species that tropical tree that has like these sort of like dangerous qualities about it, but also, to me, it has a very warm place in my heart because I grew up with it. Like the jabillo tree is covered in thorns that are poisonous to you. Like they're not going to kill you, but like they'll give you a nasty infection. And the tree has fruit that disperses the seed by exploding when it ripens. And so when you read about the tree from this point of view, from this removed point of view, in Canada, it's always referred to like as this tree that is like, oh, you don't want to plant, you don't want that anywhere near you. But to me, it kind of has this sort of like sort of warm quality. And the drawing of the Pepsi building is sort of a funny one because I don't have a lot of memories outside of my neighborhood because when we moved out, I was 14, sorry. And so the landmarks of the city that do exist in my brain are these sort of like weird, like quirky parts of Caracas. And one of them is this strange billboard that doesn't exist anymore that used to be in the headquarters of Pepsi in Caracas, which was like this big Pepsi Bowl billboard. And to me, it was like embedded in my head of like the mountains, this tree, and the weird like avenue that was like near it that I can't remember the name of. To me, I'm okay with that, but like it's sort of this reconstructive thing. And finally, the other one is a bird called Huacharaca, which is the most obnoxious bird in the whole world. It's like this weird turkey.
That's why you blurred it.
That's why I blurred it, yeah. That's funny. My sister commented on the photo I posted of it recently, and she was like, no.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because it's, but anyways, it's like, again, this like really abrasive thing that like I associate with home too in a weird way. It's like, so like that removal to me is an interesting difference.
But it's interesting because you talk about memory, I think, a lot more with your practice than I do. Like, I think people feel memory when they look at my paintings, but for me, it's not about memory necessarily. I repeat forms over and over again to get a different iteration every time of the same form. So it looks like it's like a fleeting memory, but
Or constructing.
Yeah.
It's funny, sorry, coming back a bit to the images, it's just like, doesn't feel nostalgic maybe, and now that you're talking about all like the elements that you decide to pick and describe them as obnoxious or dangerous, or like there's an aspect of like just familiarity of this, not necessarily longing for them.
Yeah, definitely. I think like I think like the kind of relationship that I'm interested in to like my own past, like the reason why I find it interesting is because I think that it's to me, I've become quite used to the idea and concept of like not really being from the place. Like I to this point, like I've been in Canada for like to 2004 for like 19 years now. And so I still feel a sort of a sense of like this connection to the places that I live in.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's more of a, it's like, I think it's soaked in a lot of like trying to explore how I define my relationship to place, and like through that process, hopefully like kind of like open a similar kind of contemplation in the people that access the work as well. So for me, it's not a longing, it's more like a trying to understand. And so like the sort of like sense of nostalgia, it's like it's hard for me to say that I miss Venezuela because Venezuela is like a hard place to be in. It's like, but it's my fam, like it's, well, anyways. The politics of Venezuela get really murky really fast, and so I'm gonna like maybe stay away from it for now.
Cool. It's also very different stories of, and maybe this is related to what you were also saying. It's not about memory, but it's constructing. Very different immigration stories. Like you moved here when you were 15, and you were born here. But you in a household that people that was not from here. Right? So for me, it makes sense that yours is more of building and yours is more about like remembering. Cool. So I think like we spoke a bit about this nature of like working in a two-person show. Not necessarily. I don't know if you necessarily have something else to say about that as well.
Not particularly, but if you do,
definitely no. I think it's actually a good moment for us to open for questions, and of course I have questions prepared myself. But okay, let's start with the public.
So, I mean, just on the segueing on what you said at the end, is this the first time that you guys do a duo?
Yeah, like a duo, like with each other?
Not between you, like you and some other.
Yes.
Yeah.
For me, wait, I'm thinking. I think so.
I think so as well.
Just wanted to maybe hear your impressions of that versus thinking of like a solo.
I have way more fun having group shows than I do solo shows, although I'm very grateful for solo shows. I'm so grateful. But like it's just more fun, and I'm also somebody who loves to throw DIY stuff together with friends, even if I'm having show. Like I don't know, it's just like a part of me and my wider practice that I put a lot of emphasis on and value. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is what I really liked about our process is when we were I think we were like checking in enough to like know that we had sort of like parameters, but I think we kind of were also like leaving enough room to like to grow. And I think like there is one of the beautiful things about I think for me, for like art making in general is like thinking about where you think you're going to end up, observing where you actually ended up, and then analyzing the distance between the two spots. And like I think there's a certain amount of like planning that we can do, but like to me the most exciting part is like how far away or how close would we actually fall to that expectation, and like what are the elements that make that happen.
Because I mean, installation day is the culmination of any group show or two-person show. So how do you plan for that? I don't know.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that.
Is there questions from the public? Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
A question for my sister. Thank you both for explaining it. I know you both pretty well, but it's nice to hear.
I don't know you that well.
It's nice to hear that, especially from people saying that. I was just
I thought you were going to pull a smoke out.
I was wondering, so you bring up cultural withdrawal, which is the first. I don't know the writer that you referred. Did he live his life in Lebanon? Did he move?
Yeah, he like similar to our parents, like just grew up there.
So
Yeah.
in our context, because I know I'll make assumptions. Tell me if you don't think of them in the same way. But just to set up the question. So in terms of this act, maybe are you able to pinpoint maybe an act? Is it our grandfather's departure, grandfather and grandmother's departure? Is that the sort of
Like the event?
like, I guess, and again, maybe I'm not interpreting withdrawal well, but it's sort of not a rejection, but it's a withdrawal from Lebanon, from the place where, like, his family lived for
It's
200
all of
years.
that. It's all of those.
So when
Yeah.
you're working then, because our father who immigrated had to interact with that in a way, I'm assuming with less vocabulary than we have and less of an understanding, but definitely, as we know, had, and he's a painter as well, our father, so you see.
Nice surprise to hear.
I forgot to tell
I didn't
you.
know
But
that.
it's even more, his experience was more sort of, a lot more chained maybe to these sort of notions, because he had to live another life as a businessman to satisfy because the intention, if there's an intention behind this withdrawal, is to build life. So I guess my question is, when you're working with these symbols of taitas, golden soap dish, birds on whatever, do you see your painting them an act of like sort of honoring or recalling those actions, or is it a part of just a continuation of the same story?
Yeah,
Because it's something that I think about as well. When
really
I
good
work, so,
question. Yeah.
but yeah, sort of like the intention behind, yeah. So is it intentional, honoring, or is it a natural thing that's happening because you're a child of?
Yeah.
this withdrawal?
It's a good question. It's definitely both. I've used the word offering, and that word really speaks to me. There was a period where I was painting the Virgin Mary from there's a pilgrimage site, Our Lady of Lebanon. It's a massive statue of the Virgin Mary, which you were 2 and I was 10 when we saw it. But that image, like, for me, it's like, my paintings, I mean, for whoever cares to look at them and respond to them, it's an offering. But it's also my way of just expressing all of that. So yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Listening to you guys each talk about your practices, there's 2 quotes that have always stuck with me, and I think they kind of apply to both of you. One is that words are the fossils of poems, and the other one is that is from The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is each memory recalled must do some violence to its origins. So as you're kind of eavesdropping from that, what I found interesting was you were kind of tying it to your childhood, whatever it was, the forms, the iconography, whatever it was. And what I'm thinking about is, as artists, just my kind of feeling of it, understanding of it, is that whether you understand the story or not, the story is still in you. So you end up breathing that meaning into it, whether the Virgin Mary has any meaning to or not. So I don't know if that's exactly a question, but I've been thinking a lot about.
It's a nice comment, though. Yeah.
My family came from Yugoslavia.
Yeah,
I grew up
yeah.
an hour outside of here.
And you're an artist who expresses also, so it's
But I also know
yeah.
that this landscape,
Yeah.
specific to this area, is what I grew up with personally. And even though historically I'm not from here, it still ends up being a huge part of my language. So that's with Canada, with kind of living here when you're a little bit older, when you're raised here. How do you feel all of that kind of applies to where you're at today?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. Do you want to do that?
yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful, like, yeah, it's like deconstructing that is, yeah, I mean, you mean like, just to make sure that I'm like going in the same direction as you, when you're talking about like where we at right now. Can I get you to say it again? Sorry, I
Well,
just
like with your use of language and imagery, specifically like using words that you're kind of putting in a place that doesn't know what that word is necessarily. But you're still using it as a material. You're still using it as an offering for people to respond to. Like you just said that you have your intention of where you want to get to, and when you get there, you measure back, looking at from where you may have started, where you first started seeing these things as being central to your practices, to now. I mean, so much more has come out in the conversation in the art world now. People are talking about shifting cultures, moving.
Yeah.
Language isn't a great upon meaning, so
Yeah.
we keep moving these things ahead. Do you feel that where you're at now, I guess, from where you began to where you're at now, how does that kind of intention that you thought you were on look and rest?
Okay, I see where they're.
Sorry, it's been a few years since I've
No, that's great.
No,
That's
it's okay.
awesome.
Thank you
Yeah.
for going over it again.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, well, it's where I began. Yeah, it's funny because like I feel that I've the process of making mark in a way begins sometimes. When you say where you began, I'm maybe going back. I'm taking that as like going back like maybe quite a few years back, or like where I began making work, and it's always sort of like a make and reassess, and so like slowly realizing like the things that I was becoming interested in, and what the value of the processes that I was engaged in, either with language or image making. I think how part of it is like I started realizing a little bit more what those things meant to me, and for me, it's sort of like in a lot of ways, I take a lot of comfort in knowing that like there's a lot of experiences that I have that are translatable to a really wide spectrum of experiences, and so for me, where I'm at right now is it's like trying to pull out an experience that may maybe that's not a good way of putting it, but like I'm trying to use the point of view where I began just as a departure point, and hoping that through like the way that I work, that it sort of invites a similar contemplation. In terms of like where I think I'm at right now, I think that's kind of where I'm at, but like what it's doing, it's always like, this is why like artist talks are really like important to me, and like this sort of process of reassessment, and like being in school, like the conversation with the public is really interesting. It's probably for me the most interesting part is like hearing what the work is doing. I'm always that's for me like the most vital part of it, and so that's kind of where I'm at right now, I guess. I know it's a very murky response, but
Thank you. I saw someone else raising. Oh yeah, Laura.
It's just that I don't think I have a question. It's more just an observation that you may or may not want to respond to.
Let's do it.
But I was thinking about what you said, Raúl, when you were observing the fact that when you're away from these images, from Uzama's drawings, sorry.
you can call them paintings.
When you're far away, you kind of, your first impression is that you're looking at photographs or something, and then you come closer, and then you realize that it's not what you were expecting. And so at some point when you get closer to these images, you feel like you're way too far close. Like you're past the surface, you're past the focal point. And even when you're from a certain distance, you have this feeling of, you're either too far removed or too far ahead. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like you haven't spoken about that feeling of going past. And because I also have the same feeling, like I see this when I look at your paintings, Chantal. I feel like as if the surfaces have been removed and you're just into a certain depth inside the painting or inside a thought or inside a memory. As if, as if that idea about withdrawal and removal has been reversed to going a little bit too far into. And that blurs things as much, and that makes you, as a viewer, really disoriented. It's a kind of decentering for me that exists in truth, a depth instead of something that is only horizontal or like about the margins, So it has this weird. I don't know if you want to speak to that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I mean, Laurence knew us in Guelph. So I feel like it's important to say that. We went to school with Laurence, and so our work as it's like transforming into what it is now as well. But I appreciate you bringing that up because disorientation was really important for me for a long time. I would literally flip the paintings around to disorient myself so that I wouldn't have, foreground, middle ground, background, because to me that is speaking the closest to what I'm trying to communicate. And this, I think, is also connecting for me to what Brett brought up, in that looking back, I feel like I've been trying to do the same thing for a long time, but it transitioned into instead of me dealing with paintings in a representational and narrative way, it moved into how is the building of the painting going to communicate that. So I'm still obsessed with my materials, my process. I play a lot with ratios of alkyd and mineral spirits and oil to get the effect that I want. So I relate to what you're saying in that, and it's nice that you see that in the work too. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment too, because of I think that one of the things that translates from my installation work to these images the most is the body to work relationship, and there's this sort of like the evolution you described of like how you relate to the images. I'm really glad to hear that you experienced it that way, because that was for me and my work was intentional, and that it drove the scale of the work and also how the work evolves in terms of like your realization of what the image is and where it comes from, and that ties for me a little bit with like the sort of disorientation that you're describing for your work. For me, that is not, maybe disorientation is not quite the same for me, but more of like making people sort of like still feel a little bit dislocated from what they thought they were encountering. And to me, that goes back a little bit to this sort of sense of making the work feel sort of unfamiliar or foreign or like difficult to like pinpoint. So that is it's really lovely to hear you describe that. That you perceive that evolution in your of the work as you move to the space. So thank you.
Cool. So we're in the 1 hour mark. Is there any last couple of questions, or last question maybe? Yeah.
I did have a question. If it's sort of like generating from both of
Yeah.
come before, because I was already thinking when you brought up that Cormac McCarthy quote, I was already thinking along those lines. I'm not familiar with the quote, but that like essential concept of like remembering or generating work from a memory can be, like you said, an act of violence, or it can scrape away at the memory itself. And so that was making me wonder, I guess this is a bit more towards Jose, but if you feel like responding to it as well, I was wondering if you find that certain material practices or certain like methods to be more destructive towards memory or not. So like I know that I've found when writing that can be more destructive to memory because the writing becomes so concrete that it sort of dissolves the nuance of the memory when it hasn't been committed to something specific. And so I imagine a process like this might be more gentle towards memory because it's so hazy, so it like retains the nuance. And then another thing I was thinking in response to what you're talking about, of that experience of thinking it's a photograph and then realizing it's not, and how we trust photographs as keepers of memory more than we do things that are not of the moment in the way that a photograph is. And then having that experience of thinking it's a photo and then realizing it's not, and how that connects to the whole concept of recalling. I don't know if these are any things that you've been thinking about or curious to respond to.
No, absolutely. It's super interesting that you talk about I'm gonna address like because you brought up a few things that I find interesting. One of them is which one could be more destructive. It's so funny. I thought about this and I thought the opposite because of the amount of visualization that I had to do, and I had to like think about it so much. And like, for example, like the image of the Pepsi building, I didn't look at a single photo of that building at all until after, and I was like kind of surprised. It was kind of close, but it was also like really off. And but I thought, to me, that was really interesting because I was like, the image that I have now in my head is like this thing that I made, and so like to me, it's just like a very cemented in that way. And in a way that it's actually something that I've sort of like put aside for like future exploration. Is like willingly changing your own past by doing this drawing process. For me, was like really, or this digital image fabrication process. It's funny because like I thought it was like hyper destructive. But I can see also how like writing, you're right, like writing just have this sort of like cementing kind of thing to it as well. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, the trusting the photograph as being this sort of like a more accurate depiction of a thing that happened. That is the reason why I've worked so hard towards like making them look photographic, so that they would sort of bring you into this position of like, oh, this is factual. And the process of realization where it's not becomes then sort of like the more like the experience that I'm looking for is that sort of the realization of like it not being a photograph. And it's also kind of drew a little bit the composition of the work too, because of the way that I tend to think about trying to recall something is sort of like the object lives in the center of the image, and so all of like the image, all of the compositions in the images are like center composition for that reason too, of like trying to highlight the thing that you're trying to recall. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'll go over time if I start answering that. But I would have a lot to say, but the one thing I will just say is what you're touching on for me is, I like to allow the material to do that for me. And that's my way of not framing myself or pigeonholing myself. And that's why I also don't trust my own description or my own words of framing. So when you talk about words, painting is the language. The art making is the language. And so, post MFA, I'm always like trying to break down the walls that were built up for many years, and just, it is what it is. And so I love kind of going back to each even statement, like exhibition statement that I've had or from the past shows, and changing the language. I allow myself that freedom. And I think that does not happen as much as it should. especially in the painting world. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, I see a lot of painters in the room, but I really love just like challenging those painting words that are buzzwords and very specific to painting. I don't even know if that answered what you were talking about, but
Interesting, because I feel like I have a relationship to it that's maybe similar to you as well. I'm not a painter, I'm more of a sculptor, installation, everything with
still though, yeah,
I also feel like engaging with materials over words, because I also write as well, but there's like a more of an openness, and I guess because it is like a nonverbal communication, it feels like it can do some of the talking for me.
Yeah,
which I love.
for sure.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that thought. Yeah.
Cool. So maybe this would be a good moment to start wrapping up. Any last questions?
It's so hot. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's like
thank
you're
you for
so
putting up with it.
patient.
Yeah, thank you a lot
Thank you,
for
Raúl.
staying
Thank you so
here.
much.
It's very
And-
hot. But just to reminding everyone, this is the first iteration of like this sort of like new thing called Artists in Dialogue. And yeah, the exhibition is going to be until July 23rd. And yeah, thank you a lot also. Well, of course, thank both of you for your generosity and talking about the
Yeah.
work.
Thanks
For coming from Toronto for this, but also thanks to the people that came and discussed, and just being present feels very good. Okay.